One of the things that we've become increasingly appreciative of during the pandemic is our scientists and our doctors. And it is their efforts that have helped to develop the vaccine and to be able to roll that vaccine out to as many people as possible, as well as nurses and healthcare professionals across the NHS. Well, today's guest is both training to be a doctor and an expert scientist. My name is Simon Henderson. I am Head of History and Sixth Form at Teesdale School, and this is episode 24 of Made in Teesdale.
Made in Teesdale.
And we actually sat there one night watching John Wayne's stagecoach film projected onto the wall while looking down at the scene below.
It is absolutely fascinating seeing inner city London children dropped into the middle of a working farm.
I have very fond memories of growing up in Teesdale. I mean, living in the countryside and having, loads of fresh air, loads of space to play.
It really is the case that if you come from County Durham, and in my case have lived in southwest London for 40 years, County Durham's still what I call home.
Made in Teesdale.
My guest for this episode is Rhian Llewellyn, who I interviewed during lockdown. So when we did our interview, she was staying in halls of residence at the university hospital where she works. And Rhian is not only training to be a doctor, but she's also doing medical research. Hi Rhian, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Good. I wonder if you could start by telling us where you grew up in Teesdale and some memories of your early life in Teesdale.
So I grew up in Hutton Magna. I went to school in Startford, and then went to Teesdale. Growing up in Teesdale, a lot of walks in the countryside. That was pretty much it. It was just me. I don't have any siblings. There weren't that many other kids in my village, so it was pretty much just me on my own, reading or going for walks, stuff like that. And then I started at Teesdale.
Which tell me, obviously you come from that tiny little village and went to a little primary school. Talk to me about experiences of Teesdale School. Bit bigger school, more friends. What? Tell me about that.
So I met different people from other primary schools, like Green Lane and stuff, when I went to Teesdale, and I'm still actually friends with those people, to this day. Especially the friends that I had from year 8 until sixth form. I'm still friends with those people, and we still really regularly keep in touch. You
used to get involved in lots of extracurricular activities. Sometimes academic related, sometimes not. Tell us about some of the things that you did.
So I played violin in school, played in orchestra with school, which was really fun, and what did I do? Did some sports, I think, did netball and stuff at various times.
Now I seem to remember that you were in a good way. You were a relatively opinionated young lady, and you like to get involved with school council, and you like to get involved with some sort of.
I don't think I ever made it onto the school council. I'm not gonna lie.
I think you were too radical.
No, I didn't think I made it onto the school council. Maybe I was just shouty or something.
Yeah, I just remember if you thought something, it didn't take too long until people knew what that was. So tell me about the subjects that you studied at A level and what you went on to do after that.
So for A level, I did biology, chemistry, physics, and English Lit, and I really enjoyed all of them. And then I went to med school at UCL in 2016, and then while I was at med school, I did an intercalated BSc, which is like quite common to do, which is basically where you do a year of a different degree and then you get like a BSc as well as your medical degree. So I did that in neuroscience and I really enjoyed it. And doing something outside of medicine. So I decided to do a PhD in neuroscience with the aim of being a doctor and also doing research. That was my plan. So that's something at the moment. And then I got to go back to med school, and then after that I'll be a doctor. Yeah.
What made you decide to do the BSc?
So at UCL it's compulsory. You have to do 6. So some medical schools have a 5-year course, and then you can opt to do a BSc year as well, which quite a lot of people do. But UCL is compulsory. You have to do the BSc year. So I didn't have a choice, which is a boring answer, but that's what happened.
Okay, so I take it you chose that when you were choosing your options about which medical school to go to, you chose that on purpose. What was it that attracted you about the idea of having that?
So I like the idea that I like the idea of being compulsory because it means that if you have close friends that don't do it, you might not end up in the same year as them, whereas everybody stays in the same year, which I like the idea of being compulsory. So the reason why I want to do it is because it gives you a different perspective about learning and doing things essentially, and like a different set of skills. Because in medicine, it's basically just spoon feeding and rote learning essentially until you qualify. Whereas with the BSc, you have to read original research papers, you have to write essays, you have to do a lab project, write a thesis, all that kind of thing. So it's more independent learning and different skills, more critical thinking, stuff like that, and also insight into how research is actually done, which is important for doctors to be aware of, I guess, because how like treatments are developed and stuff like that.
So why neuroscience? Why did you choose that one?
Because it was just the module I enjoyed most in my first 2 years. Yeah.
What is it about it though? What is it about that really fascinates you?
I think possibly just the fact that there's so much that we don't understand. There's so many questions. Like you could keep asking questions for 100 years, and there's people have been asking questions about Alzheimer's for 100 years pretty much, and there's still no treatments and no real understanding of how it works. So that I just thought was really interesting. And there's kind of a lot to contribute because there's so much that's unknown. So if you find anything out, it's contributing to something, basically. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So you're doing a PhD now. Now my conception from my own PhD, that just was a lot of time for me, spending times in archives, reading stuff, interviewing people, and then writing a big long thesis.
Yeah.
How does a medical PhD look different? Are you doing experiments on things? Are you collecting data?
So I'm not currently doing experiments. Basically, I am analysing data using computer programming at the moment. And I'm going to get my own data from some brain samples that we've got a hold of, but I'm not actually going to do the practical experiments on that. I'm just going to analyse the data from them. So what I'm learning to do in my PhD is use computer programming to analyse biological data for conclusions to come out of that, basically. Okay. Yeah.
And what, without getting too technical on me, because you might lose me, what talk to us about what your understanding and what the medical fraternity's understanding of what Alzheimer's is and how it works, and then what are you trying to find out to try and combat that?
Yeah, so basically, Alzheimer's happens because proteins, which are normally in the brain, become produced in larger amounts than normal and clump together in these plaques that they're called, basically. And these plaques are toxic to the brain tissue around them in some way, and it causes the brain to shrink over time. And that causes problems like memory loss, language difficulty, all the things that you recognise as somebody who has Alzheimer's. So people who have Down syndrome have a very high risk of getting Alzheimer's at an early age, a much earlier age than the general population, because they have genetic differences that cause these toxic proteins to be made in higher amounts throughout life. So we understand the main genetic differences that cause that, but there are other genetic differences that we think are important. So I basically investigate what other genetic differences might contribute to this process which will help make sure that any treatments for Alzheimer's can be applied to people with Down syndrome, and also give information about the genetic basis for Alzheimer's, which could help the general population as well. And what I'm particularly interested in is nobody really understands how these plaques made of toxic protein lead to brain cells dying and brain shrinking. That's the bit that's not understood. So a lot of people think that the immune system in the brain is important in some way. So I basically study immune cells in the brain and what they do. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I know my own grandfather on my mother's side, he got Alzheimer's, and he deteriorated relatively quickly, and he used to be a law professor at a university in Sheffield, and he went from doing lots of stuff where I guess he was using his mind and he was working with people, and then he lived on his own. So he went from that after he retired to kind of nothing. And I know we always thought that maybe his Alzheimer's made worse because of the fact that he'd used his brain really a lot and then just suddenly switched off and didn't really do anything. Is that just sort of anecdotal nonsense, or is there any science behind that?
There's a few different points there. So there's this idea about cognitive reserve, which is actually that people who have more education earlier in life are less vulnerable to Alzheimer's, because the idea is that if you lose some brain function, then you have more brain function left if you have more brain function to start with. But that's not clear cut at all. It's a controversial thing. There are risk factors for Alzheimer's, such as loneliness, and not using your brain in later life appears to, I mean, you always read those Daily Mail studies that, like, if you do crosswords, it stops you getting Alzheimer's.
Yeah,
there is probably something in that. Yeah, there's probably something in that, because loneliness, for example, is a risk factor for onset. Probably because your brain uses so much power to socialize that you don't even realize. But humans are social animals, and half the reason we have such big brains and such developed language and stuff is because we use a lot of brain power on social interaction. So that's something that's a theory. But all of these things are quite, they're not concrete proven. I can't tell you like this causes this, which causes this. It's kind of just ideas. But yeah. So there's some ideas. I guess for other people, it is just intuitively more upsetting to see somebody who used to have a really high level of function lose that. But I'm not sure if there's anything really biological in there.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, it's a bit sort of putting the cause after the effect. Like you've seen that and then you've traced it backwards, and that might not actually have been the cause in the first place. It's, you know, I feel on your behalf that even if that this must be quite exciting, because imagine if you know, when I was doing my PhD research, okay, I found out some relatively interesting things about race and sport in America in the 1960s, but it wasn't really going to change anybody's life. If you read my thesis, you could find something, discover something, do something that could radically change the way we understand Alzheimer's or treat it. Is that exciting? Is that motivating?
Yeah, so the way that science works is that sometimes, occasionally, one person will like discover penicillin and change the world. That's not a common thing, and it's not something to aim for because it's so uncommon. Basically, what normally happens is that 1,000 or multiple thousands of people discover a tiny thing, which eventually, years down the line, somebody can put all these tiny pieces of information together to make a big change. So I might publish a couple of papers, I will publish a thesis, and somewhere in there, there'll be some tiny piece of information which eventually cause something to change, hopefully. Yeah, that's kind of more my perspective.
Yeah, well, yeah, even Alexander Fleming, who covers penicillin, he didn't do anything about it properly, so he didn't do all the clinical tests, so it took for other people to take his idea.
They didn't know how to manufacture it and all that stuff.
Yeah, so it's obviously, science is about a community of people working together. when this might sound like a really ignorant question, but it just fascinates. So when you finish your PhD, if you then go and finish your medical degree, will you be MD PhD? Will you be Dr. Llewellyn?
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be like Doctor Squared or something. I think it's called an MBBS PhD. MD PhD is like the American term for it. I guess like Dr. Llewellyn MBBS PhD. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you should go with Dr. Llewellyn. I think that's got a nice ring to it. So smart they named me twice, Dr. Llewellyn. So when you've got 4 years through medical school and then you've gone to do your PhD, so that means that I would suggest you're nearly a doctor. Like, you know how to do lots of stuff to look after people. So what sort of practical medical things have you been doing during the current pandemic? How have hospitals been using you to do things?
So I've been working in ICU as a healthcare assistant, which basically just means that I'm helping an ICU nurse, because normally ICU nurses look after one person at a time, but in recent weeks they've been looking after 4, even 5 people at a time, and that means that when one nurse goes for a break, one nurse is looking after 8 people, which is obviously not possible. So they've basically got an army of various people with some skills, like medical students, like nurses who've used to work on wards and have gone and done research or something and been out of the front line for a while, and trained us to do some basic stuff to help the ICU nurses. So that's what I've been doing, which has been really fun and really rewarding. You definitely feel completely different from being a medical student. Being a medical student is like being a burden on everyone's time and just being there to learn, whereas you're actually able to help people, which I found really, really good, basically. Yeah.
So was that something that you volunteered for, or was that you were recruited, like basically all the medical students need to get yourselves in there and help out?
They were just like, they gave us the opportunity to, and we do get paid. Like, I don't want it to sound like it's some sort of, like, we are being employed to do this. Yeah. And the medical school just sent out an email being like, anyone who wants to do this can do it. So yeah.
And how does that, you're in a place where lots of people have got COVID because you're in that ward.
Yeah.
You've got PPE on, but extent, are you kind of thinking about your own health, or does that just not come into your mind?
It doesn't. So I am very fortunate that I'm like ridiculously low risk from COVID. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take precautions, because as Chris Whitty would say, everyone can be one person in a chain of transmission that leads to a vulnerable person. So you shouldn't disregard precautions and stuff like that. And obviously I don't. But in terms of me personally catching COVID, I don't really worry about it. Also, I have been exposed to loads of people throughout the pandemic that have had COVID, and I've probably had it at some point asymptomatically. And I was really lucky to get a vaccine over 3 weeks ago now, which means that I'm now protected from the vaccine. So in terms of my own health, I don't worry at all. I'm not living with any vulnerable people. I don't regularly come into contact with vulnerable people. So yeah, it's not really a concern, which is kind of why I wanted to do it, because obviously there are healthcare workers who are vulnerable for whatever reason. Yeah, I can't imagine being in that position of having to go to work or make the decision about going to work when you're in that position.
Yeah. So give us some hope that this is going to be all better, or at least significantly better in 6 to 12 months, and tell us why medically and scientifically and rationally it's going to be okay.
I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't study infectious diseases. I don't study vaccines just because I've been to medical school for like 4 years. I'm not qualified to give any advice, basically. So I can only parrot what more educated people have said on BBC News already. So yeah, probably just listen to them, to be honest. Sorry.
It's okay, the vaccines are the way out of it, though.
Yeah, that's what they say, isn't it? So hopefully, yeah.
So, yeah, I can see, our listeners won't be able to see, but you're in a little sort of, it looks like a little pod, but it's a little University College London accommodation, and
Yeah.
you're in there, and I presume you're in there on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of time spent either researching or just being on your own. A lot of time for our students at the moment and their parents, and being at home, what advice would you have? If you can imagine back to yourself at school and thinking that you would have missed out on, getting up to 6 months worth of schooling now, and you've got to do lessons online and things from home, what advice would you give them to try and keep them going?
I would say definitely make the most of seeing people in person as far as you can within government guidance. So the going for a walk outside with one person socially distant is really something I've personally found really helpful. Like, I've been for multiple walks a week with one other person from my household, and I think there is just something about seeing other people in person that you can't really get around. So if you are able to do that, do that. In general, just leaving the house, I think, is helpful. Set like clear boundaries for your time when you're supposed to be working and when you're not working. That's something I found really helpful. And if possible, like a space, if you're able to work downstairs and chill out upstairs or something like that, if it's possible. I mean, I'm like kind of living in one room, so I understand it's really difficult to do that sometimes, but if you can, that's been helpful. Just the standard, keep in touch with people on Zoom or whatever. Yeah, that's pretty much. I didn't have any crazy insights, but that's pretty much what I've been doing.
That sounds like the sort of insight that's very wise. And so, when you are in your little room and you are not trying to cure Alzheimer's, or you are not helping people with COVID, what book or film or album recommendation do you have for us to help people to chill out a bit?
I'm not sure it helps people to chill out, but if you're at all interested in medicine or healthcare, there's a book called Do No Harm by Henry Marsh, which is a really great book. Definitely recommend that one. Yeah, that would be my recommendation. Sorry. It's a book about, it's a book by a neurosurgeon who has reflected on his career in neurosurgery and all the operations that he did, and it's basically this cathartic process of him explaining all the times when he feels he made a mistake or a poor judgment and how it's negatively affected somebody's life. So I don't know if it's necessarily cheery, but it's really interesting. Yeah.
Quite a brave book to write, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it confronts like issues like life, death, suffering, the limits of medical profession as just something which is done by humans who are fallible, obviously. So sometimes it's nice to think about things rather than just trying to distract yourself with keeping up with the Kardashians, which is also valid. Yeah.
Well, it has been a delight, Rhian, and it's been interesting to find out about you're very matter of fact about it, and as though it's all really quite boring. But I'm sure that I speak for the listeners who will. It's not boring, and it's quite incredible what you're doing.
Okay, thanks. It's been really nice to talk. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure that you will agree that Rhian is an incredibly impressive young woman, and we are really lucky that people like her, with the commitment and intelligence that she has, are trying to find the answers to some of the medical problems that still face us in the 21st century. So, this was the penultimate episode of Made in Teesdale. Join me next week for the final episode of this podcast series. Until then, stay safe, take care, goodbye.